that's because people are reporting more. There might be 100 events and only 30 people report it, or 60 people report it. It looks to you like there's either 30 or 60, and you might interpret that as being an increase in the number of incidents, or it might be an increase in the improvement in the reporting efficiency.
I think what's happening is people are not scared to talk about it as much as they used to be. And I think, back even 10 years ago, people didn't talk much about if they saw a UFO because, if they did, people would look at them a little bit funny. Now it's a subject you can actually talk about. I had something happen to me in the mid-'70s, which I can't explain. I had Timothy Cullen. I'm sure you know who Timothy Cullen is. He was a implant removable, had an implant removed from the late Dr. Roger Lear. And when they sent that implant out to be analyzed, it had a silver base compound, but it had other metals mixed in it that could have not been developed or formulated on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was.
I know. I knew Roger Lear. I know he did a removal of a number of items, but I'm not sure. I don't recall the one you're talking about.
Yeah, Timothy Cullen, I think, was number 13 implant removal. But it's funny. Before he saw a UFO several weeks before that. Him and his wife, they saw off the side of a hill or a mountain where he lived, they saw a UFO. And then, he got involved in a car accident, which, and then he had, things hurting. He had x-rays done. All of a sudden, in his, wrist, they found a piece of, like, something that it shouldn't have been there. And that's where they found the implant. And, it's funny, even after talking to him, because he's been on my show several times, Bruce, that after he had his implant removed,
That was in his ear, you said?
It was in the wrist.
On his wrist?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And then, after he had it removed, months went by, him and his wife are going back into town. They look off, they come up to a stop at a stop sign wherever they were getting on the road, and they saw a UFO again. And, I said, well, did you ever go back to Dr. Roger Lear and have it checked? Because maybe they abducted you a second time. He goes, no. He didn't want to go through it again.
I remember being at Roswell for one of their big Roswell celebrations, 2008 or something like that. Or, no, maybe it was 2001. In any case, there was a guy there who had something in the webbing between two fingers, and he had a magnet. He had a magnet with him, and he could run the magnet over his skin, and you could see this thing underneath being pulled towards the magnet and causing a bulge in the skin where it was. If he had a big enough magnet, it would rip it right out of his skin, I suppose.
Oh wow!
I don't remember who that man was, but it was really weird to see him move the magnet over the skin and watch this thing follow the motion of the magnet.
Well, I'm going to mention my dad during he served in World War II and then the Korean War. He met somebody while he was waiting to be transferred out of Korea back in the United States to be discharged. And that was, it turned out to be, and I didn't even realize it, it turned out to be the guy, James Gardner, the actor, the Rockford Files, and a whole bunch of movies. Yeah. And
Gardner.
Yeah, Gardner. And he was a good friend of my dad. Every summer, he would come up for about a week or so, and him and my dad would run around and do things, And, when I was a young kid, I didn't know who he was. And then when I got older one day, I watched a TV show called Maverick, and I realized who the guy was. And, later when I got a little older, I was really infatuated with Ronald Reagan. And, I mentioned it to him, to James. I said, I would really like to talk to Ronald Reagan. And at that point, Ronald Reagan was our president. And he had a show for young people. Once a month, he would come on the radio, national radio, and young people could call up the president and ask a question. Mm-hmm. Well, I never called the show, but I got a phone call from Ronald Reagan. And that was because of my friend, my dad's friend, James. And anyway, a week after, I was on the air with him and asking my question, I get a phone call from the White House. And it's Ronald Reagan. And he's just chatting with me and all that stuff. And at the time in the newspapers, they were talking about Star Wars all the time. And people were worried about the Cold War, the United States being in a nuclear war, with the Soviet Union.
I worked on that program.
Yeah, well, you know what? I asked him, quite bluntly. I said, hey, is Star Wars, is that going to protect us against Russia? Or I said the Soviet Union at the time. Being young and naive, it didn't really stick in my head. It stuck in my head, but I didn't think much of what his answer was. And he said, no, it'll protect us. It'll protect us for them out there. And I remember he stressed them out there, and that has stuck in my head. Now, you mentioned you worked a little bit on that project. Was Star Wars basically for protecting us against the Soviet Union, or was it for maybe UFOs?
I was working part of the so-called pilot project, which was an attempt by the government itself to develop a system. They had 10 different contractors that were developing different versions of what's known as an architecture for so-called Star Wars. The idea being to shoot down missiles before they could land on the United States. Either shoot them down right over where they were taking off, or shoot them down when they're up at the peak of their trajectory. They would be shooting, going upwards to a high altitude and then coming down at a high rate of speed, and it would blow up before they get to the surface of the Earth for maximum effect. The intent was to have them blow up in outer space instead of right over the country. Well, they had a whole bunch of different methods, most important ones being a powerful laser beam, a so-called neutral particle beam, or very fast small rockets. And I being well familiar with the UFO situation by that time, which was 1985, 86, 87 time frame, I kept my eyes and ears open for any hint of anything that would indicate they were looking outwards, away from the Earth, to shoot down things coming towards the Earth. But I never saw anything. Everything was pointed. All the sensors were pointed towards the Earth, or towards a small space 100 miles above the Earth, sort of, where these ballistic missiles would be traveling. I didn't see any indication of trying to repel outside borders, you might say.
No, I was just kind of curious.
They were designed to detect the launch of something and then react to the launch by sending a beam of something or other to destroy the missile.
I just, took it strange when he said it would, them out there. And it still sticks in my head. I don't know what he meant by them out there. He certainly wasn't talking about the Soviet Union, because I asked him that.
Yeah, well, there may be, other people may have had other interpretations. What I'm saying is, as far as the technology was concerned, the technology was all designed to watch what was going on at the Earth and react to things like the launch of a ballistic missile.
Interesting. So you don't think maybe Star Wars could have had maybe another motive behind it?
Well, it could have, but I never saw any indication that they were paying any attention. And I know a guy who talked to the man who was in charge of Star Wars and asked him if they were paying any attention to the possibility of outsiders coming in. And the guy, according to the man I know, the head of the Star Wars project, didn't indicate that he knew anything about things coming from way outside. It was all a question of detecting things launched from the Earth.
Interesting.
Launched from ground silos or submarines, whichever.
Now, I got to ask you, because we don't have much more time left here. I've been hearing from a lot of people that are into the UFO scene big time. I mean, that's where they spend most of their life. And some of these people are very credible. One guy was a Superior Court judge who's a lawyer here in the state of Washington. He runs a group for, doing UFO research.
I hope, being in the state of Washington, I hope you're ready to celebrate the 72nd anniversary that's coming up, June 24th, 1947 to now, June 24th, 1947 at 3 p.m. You should be ready to celebrate.
No, over the mountain, yes.
That's when Kenneth Arnold had his sighting. You can help yourself celebrate by reading 3 Minutes in June, a book I wrote, available on Amazon, which is the only book devoted to the first flying saucer sighting.
Oh, yeah. Again, what's the name of the book there, Bruce?
3 Minutes in June, the sighting that changed the world.
And that is available on Amazon.
Yes, along with the legacy of 1952. And a third book, the FBI-CIA UFO Connection. That's, I guess, my flagship book. The FBI-CIA UFO Connection is a history of, you might imagine the FBI, the CIA, and Air Force, and it even tells the stories of my direct interactions with the CIA in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, interesting. I just wonder what type of threats they made, to a lot of pilots. I do know a attorney who knew the attorney of that one at the beginning of the show. You mentioned that airline, the Japanese pilot that,
right.
Reported a UFO, and it almost ended his career. And it took some real legal maneuvering to keep him from losing his license and being reinstated. But, it's interesting. But in the last couple months, these group of people are saying that something is coming down on disclosure, and it's going to hit shortly. And I've been hearing this. Of course, I've been in and out of broadcasting since 1976. Art Bell was a friend of mine, and me and Art would talk about that off air quite a bit. What is your feeling? Do you think something is in the makes some type of disclosure that might be happening, or do you think it's just more debunking?
Before I answer that, I'd like to add something to the 3 Minutes in June. Since what made me think of it was you're in the state of Washington. The 3 Minutes in June event of June 24th, 1947, took place near Mount Rainier.
Oh yes, yeah.
So you ought to get the book and read it. It'll blow your mind. It's got just about everything in it but abductions. Anyway, as far as something happening, well, that's what this situation with the Navy releasing 3 videos taken by pilots in F-18 jets, videos of things moving at high speed, and visual testimony and radar detections. I did a calculation based on some radar information given by a radar operator, Kevin Day, in the last year and a half ago or so, about how he saw objects that were traveling at 100 miles an hour, 100 knots, I should say, at 28,000 feet, and all of a sudden they would drop down to the surface of the ocean in 7/10 of a second or something like that, 8/10 of a second, and then travel along a little bit at this height just above the ocean, and then zip back up to the 28,000 feet and resume their 100-knot travel, was going southward. That video and a couple of others have been made available with the implication that the Navy is going to be taking this subject more seriously. But we may not be able to get any of the data based on what they just said today. That they're not going to release data where there could be a compromise of technical capability that would allow the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else to determine our capabilities from released information. So they presumably won't be telling us every case that happens. Maybe they won't tell us any of them. I don't know.
Well, I do find it interesting.
But that does ramp up the possibility of disclosure.
It does, but I'm going back almost 2 years ago. The 2 pilots off the Nimitz out of off of California. They took after a UFO that was their afterburners.
David Fravor, right?
Yeah.
Fravor's talk about seeing this object way down sort of got